Hi, this is Philip Cotro with depthsofpentecost.com, teachings that bring you deeper into the Word of God. This is part 10 of our video series on why the New Testament was written. Tonight we'll be talking about why Luke wrote the book of Acts. If you go back to my earlier video on the Synoptic Gospels, you'll learn that Luke wrote his gospel to a church bishop named Theophilus, who may or may not have also been a Roman official. The book was addressed to Theophilus and the Gentiles. Matthew as a gospel was essentially a Jewish book written by a Jew for the Jews to proclaim Jesus as the fulfiller of the messianic prophecies. Luke, on the other hand, is kind of an antithesis to that because Luke was a Gentile. He was the apprentice to Paul, who was the one preaching to the Gentiles. And it's written for a primarily Gentile audience to explain who Jesus is. Luke and Acts are sort of meant to be read as twin volumes, a part 1 and a part 2. So you could go to the end of Luke and you could begin to read Acts and you could see the two of them as really one long continuous book. Acts is also addressed to Theophilus as well. Since the class last week, we talked about 1 Timothy, and where our story leaves off now, if you read through the New Testament at this point and you understand the narrative, you can detect the tension beginning to rise in the Roman Empire. There's a sense of impending dread that something terrible is coming. And it started with the Emperor Nero, who the first few years of his reign was primarily a peaceful ruler, but that time of peace is coming to an end because Nero was a murderer and he was a psychopath and really was going to turn out to be a terrible Caesar and will be famous for the great persecution of the Christians. We are getting close to that terrible moment at this point in the story. And Nero, very shortly after Luke wrote Acts, would end up burning Rome and putting the blame on the Christians to sort of gin up fear and dread and suspicion in the city towards this group of people so it could justify his persecution of them. So this is the point of a lot of literature that's produced that actually appeals to Rome with an attempt to legitimize Christianity. Acts is only one example of that. Later on in the Roman Empire, there are other examples. If you read the writings of the church fathers, you can find that they wrote letters that were appeals to Caesar and appeals to the Roman government, trying to explain that Christianity is a legitimate movement and a real religion and doesn't deserve this kind of persecution. Acts may actually be the first attempt at that because Luke is writing to Theophilus, who may or may not have been a Roman official, and it's an orderly account of the beginning of Christianity from the time of Jesus up until that point. And it spells out the history and what the Acts of the Apostles were, basically to try to give the religion legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman kingdom so they would not persecute the Christians. It goes back over the past 30 years, and it's just a record of the historical events up to that point, except for one exception. Last week we talked about Paul having left his house arrest in Rome, and he was let go due to lack of evidence. Luke doesn't actually get to that point. When he writes Acts, he stops with Paul ending in Rome to begin his 2-year house arrest. And he may have intentionally ended the story there because the message he was trying to get, because his audience was to Rome, it was to Roman officials, he was trying to get the message across that Christianity has come to the Roman kingdom. So it may have been intentional that he cuts the story off as soon as Paul arrives. That's kind of symbolic, like Christianity has arrived in this city. Acts is a very important book in the New Testament, not just for back then, but for today as well. Luke is considered by many to be one of the most thorough historians of ancient times. I mean, Luke can stand shoulder to shoulder with men like Josephus and Tacitus and many of the other great historians of ancient times. The amount of detail that he got right about the Roman kingdom and this sort of picture we have of life in ancient Rome is really unparalleled. It's unmatched. First thing about Acts is that it really fails to mention the deaths of Paul and Peter, which is a significant event in the history of Christianity. Perhaps even more profound is that it doesn't mention the temple siege of AD 70, which is the moment when the Jews began an uprising against the Roman Empire, finally trying to overthrow the Roman kingdom, and this would end up failing, and the Romans would siege the city, and they would destroy the temple to the ground, and the Jews would be scattered into exile across the Roman Empire. Now, this is such an important event because it's the destruction of Israel at that time as we know it, but it's also a fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus made. Jesus said that the temple would be destroyed. It's also prophesied in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Now, if the New Testament were written after AD 70 and was written with the knowledge that the temple had been destroyed, it would mention that somewhere in the book, somewhere, because Jesus had prophesied it. And if you're trying to make the case that Jesus is the Messiah, of course you would include that detail. So that stands as definitive dating evidence that all of the New Testament was complete before AD 70. What's very important about Acts is that archaeological discoveries have supported the details that Luke records in his gospel and in the book of Acts. We could call this corroborating evidence. Now, my main source for these videos has been a book by Frank Viola, which is the Untold Story of the New Testament, but I'm going to use two sources tonight. One of them I've already mentioned. That's this book, Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, where a homicide detective used what he knew of eyewitness testimony and applied that forensic science to the Gospels and found them to be incredibly truthful. They bear all the tales of accurate eyewitness accounts. I'm also going to recommend I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler. And this book contains an interesting passage. I'm quoting from page 256 that classical scholar and historian Colin Hemer had chronicled Luke's accuracy in the book of Acts verse by verse, and he identified 84 details in the book of Acts that have been confirmed by archaeological discoveries or the historical records of the time. Now, I'm not going to read all 84 of them. I'm just going to read a handful of them. For example, it's little things, it's small details. Like in Acts 13, verse 13, Luke correctly identifies the proper port. He mentions Perga along the direct destination of a ship crossing from Cyprus. Another example, in Acts 19:9, Luke mentions the city of Ephesus, and he mentions the name Tyrannus. And the name Tyrannus, as attested from Ephesus, was found in first century inscriptions. Now, to read from Cold Case Christianity, a few more examples. In Acts 13:51, Luke describes the city of Iconium in Phrygia. Some ancient writers, like Cicero, wrote that Iconium was located in Lycaonia rather than Phrygia, but a monument was discovered in 1910 that confirmed Iconium as a city in Phrygia. Luke accurately described the first government that existed in first century Palestine under Roman rule. His account demonstrates that he was writing at the time and place he claimed. In Acts 22:28, he correctly described two paths to Roman citizenship. In Acts 24:1 through 9, he correctly described the process by which accused criminals were brought to trial. In Acts 25:6 through 12, he correctly described the manner in which a man could invoke his Roman citizenship and appeal his case to Caesar. In Acts 28:16 and in 30 through 31, he correctly described the manner in which a prisoner could be held by a Roman soldier and the conditions when imprisoned at one's own expense. There are other significant discoveries as well. For example, for many centuries, Luke was the only ancient writer to use the word politarch to describe rulers of the city. Skeptics doubted that it was a legitimate Greek term until 19 inscriptions were discovered. 5 of these were in reference to Thessalonica, the very city in which Luke was claiming to have heard the term. In Acts 13, Luke identified Sergius Paulus, a proconsul in Paphos. Skeptics doubted the existence of this man and claimed that any leader of this area would be a procurator rather than a proconsul, but an inscription was discovered at Soli in Cyprus that acknowledges Paulus and identified him as a proconsul. This is amazing stuff. There has never been an archaeological discovery that has contradicted anything in Luke or Acts. And it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the New Testament is a product of its time period. It is not a legendary collection of books that was written 100 years later in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd centuries like many skeptics like to claim. Everything within the Gospels and within the New Testament as a whole, we can safely date it with every discovery we found that it was written before 70 AD, and it is a product of early 1st century Roman-occupied Palestine. Unfortunately, Luke's impassioned plea in Acts is not successful, because we're going to talk about next week that the great Neronic persecutions will begin. And there is actually a connection between the writing of Acts, the beginning of the Neronic persecutions, and then the book of Hebrews, which was written in the aftermath of that. So unfortunately, Luke's book did not convince Roman officials not to persecute Christians, but it's lived on as an incredibly important book in New Testament and Christian history, and still to this day. So you really never know, like, what God orders you to do, and you can do this great, wonderful thing for the Lord, and God can be with you, but then you can watch it be a total failure in your lifetime. But then after you're gone, who knows, like, over the years and over the centuries, God can use that thing for a greater purpose. So in the short run, the book of Acts was a failure, but in the long run, it has done tremendous things for Christianity. There's other examples of this throughout history. I could go back on my blog. I have an earlier series that I wrote on the history behind the translation of the King James Version of the Bible. And the whole reason the King James Version was translated was to try to unify England under one Bible to prevent civil war from breaking out. Well, it was a dismal failure. Not too long after the King James Version was completed, King James became known for the man who persecuted the Puritans, and to such a degree that he drove them to getting on the Mayflower and setting sail for the New World. And not too long after that, England fell apart, and the result was the English Civil War, which was a total disaster. So in the short run, the King James Version was a failure at what it set out to do, but in the long run, it's done something incredible for Christianity, and it's been the best-selling version of the Bible of all time. The book of Acts ends on chapter 27. Some scholars have speculated over the years that Acts, there may be a lost chapter that concluded Acts, because it ends in an unusual way for the New Testament. Some books of the New Testament end with a prayer or with a final closing remarks. Acts doesn't. It just ends straight up. And I would argue that there is no missing chapter, that it was ended that way on purpose, because God did not want the book of Acts to ever come to a conclusion. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment. My weekly blog is depthsofpentecost.com. I put new blogs up every Saturday. I'll leave a link in the description below. Upload new videos every Tuesday. And thank you for watching, and God bless.